The iron door closes with a sound that erases the world. Inside the basement of a requisitioned townhouse in occupied Lyon, a man sits bound to a wooden chair, and the only light comes from a single bulb swinging overhead. His name is Henri Deschamps, though the men standing around him don't care what he's called. They want names, addresses, drop sites, radio frequencies. They want the entire network mapped out in his confession. And Henri, 32 years old, a schoolteacher before the war, knows that if he speaks, dozens of people will die before morning. The Gestapo officer across from him lights a cigarette and waits. This is how it begins. Not with violence, but with silence. With the terrible understanding that time itself has become a weapon. Henri had been arrested 3 days earlier at a cafe near Place Bellecour. The arrest was clean, professional, almost polite. 2 men in long coats approached his table while he was reading a newspaper, and one of them said his name like a question. He didn't run. Running would have confirmed everything. Instead, he stood slowly, folded the paper, and followed them to a black Citroën parked at the curb. The other patrons barely looked up. In Lyon in 1943, people had learned not to see certain things. The car drove through streets Henri had known his entire life, past the Basilica on Fourvière Hill, past shuttered storefronts and German checkpoints, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was heading toward a place where the rules of the world he knew no longer applied. They took him to a building that had once been a private residence, elegant and unremarkable, the kind of place a banker might have owned before the occupation. Now it served as an interrogation center for Section 4 of the Lyon Gestapo, the unit responsible for hunting resistance networks. Henri was led down a narrow staircase into a basement that smelled of damp stone and something else, something organic and wrong. There were 4 cells carved into the foundation, each with a metal door and a small barred window at eye level. They locked him in the farthest one and left him alone for hours. This too was part of the process. Let him sit. Let him imagine. Let fear do the first layer of work before anyone asks a single question. But Henri Deschamps was not an ordinary prisoner, though the Gestapo didn't know this yet. He had joined the resistance in the winter of 1941, recruited by a friend who taught at the same school, a man named Lyon who believed that silence in the face of occupation was its own kind of collaboration. Henri had started small, distributing pamphlets, passing messages, helping downed Allied airmen reach safe houses on their way to Spain. Over time his role expanded. He became a courier, then a coordinator, then one of the key figures in a network that stretched across the Rhône Valley. He knew safe houses in Villeurbanne and Saint-Étienne. He knew which railway workers could be trusted to sabotage shipments, and which police officers looked the other way. He knew the location of weapons caches and the identities of radio operators who sent intelligence back to London. In his mind was a map that could destroy everything his people had built. The interrogation began on the second day. 2 officers entered his cell and dragged him to a larger room where the single bulb hung from a cord in the ceiling. One of them was older, perhaps 50, with thin wire-rimmed glasses and the calm demeanor of a bureaucrat. The other was younger, broad-shouldered, with a face that showed nothing. They sat him in the chair and tied his wrists to the armrests with leather straps. The older man introduced himself as Hauptsturmführer Keller and explained that this could be very simple if Henri chose to cooperate. He laid out a series of photographs on a table. Faces Henri recognized. Lyon, a woman named Martha who ran a safe house near the old town, a priest who hid messages in confessionals. Keller asked if Henri knew these people. Henri said nothing. Keller nodded as if this was exactly the answer he expected. Then he stepped back and let the younger man take over. The beating that followed was methodical. Not frenzied, not angry, but calculated. Blows to the ribs, the kidneys, the soft places where pain blooms without leaving marks that might kill too quickly. Henri tried to retreat into himself, to find some interior room where his mind could hide, but the body has a way of dragging consciousness back to the surface. Between the blows, Keller asked questions. Who runs your network? Where do you meet? Who provides your weapons? Henri's silence became a kind of answer, and each silence cost him more. By the time they dragged him back to his cell, he could barely stand. They left him on the floor and locked the door. In the darkness he listened to his own breathing and tried to remember why any of this mattered. On the third day, they changed tactics. Keller returned alone, carrying a chair which he placed just outside the cell door. He sat down and spoke in a quiet, almost friendly voice. He said that Henri was going to die here, that this was not a question, but that the manner of his death was still negotiable. He could die quickly, with some measure of dignity, or he could die slowly, in pieces, alone in the dark. Keller said that heroism was a luxury afforded to people who didn't understand the mathematics of suffering. He said that every hour Henri remained silent, people in the network were being rounded up anyway because the Gestapo was patient and thorough and would find them all eventually. He said that Henri's silence was not saving anyone, only prolonging the inevitable and adding to his own pain. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice never rising, never becoming cruel. Then he stood, brushed off his trousers, and left Henri alone again. This was perhaps the most dangerous moment. Not the violence, but the logic. Because part of what Keller said was true. The Gestapo was good at its work. Networks were compromised all the time, sometimes through informants, sometimes through captured documents, sometimes through simple mistakes. Henri knew that resistance work was always a race against time, that every operation carried the assumption that eventually someone would be caught and the structure would collapse. But there was a difference, a crucial difference, between the Gestapo finding people through their own investigation and Henri handing them over directly. One might take weeks or months, giving the network time to scatter, to warn others, to rebuild. The other would happen in hours. And so Henri held on to this difference like a rope in the dark. The fourth day brought a new kind of suffering. They didn't beat him this time. Instead they used water, forcing his head back and pouring it into his nose and mouth until his body convulsed with the certainty of drowning. The sensation erases thought. There is no room for courage or ideology or memory when your lungs are screaming for air and your brain is lighting up with the animal terror of suffocation. They did this again and again, and between each session Keller asked his questions with the same bureaucratic patience. Henri's mind began to fracture. He found himself negotiating with himself, wondering if perhaps he could give them something small, something that wouldn't matter, just to make it stop. A name of someone already dead, a location already abandoned. But he knew how interrogations worked. Once you give them the first piece, they know you can be broken, and they simply continue until they have everything. By the fifth day, Henri had lost track of time. The cell had no windows, no natural light, and sleep came only in brief snatches between sessions. His body was a catalogue of pain. Broken ribs made breathing an effort. His face was swollen nearly shut. There were burns on his arms and chest from cigarettes, a technique the younger officer seemed to particularly enjoy. But something else was happening too, something Henri couldn't fully articulate even to himself. The world outside the basement was becoming unreal, a memory of a memory, while this room with its swinging bulb and its patient torturer was becoming the only reality that mattered. He began to have conversations with Keller in his mind, rehearsing answers, justifying potential betrayals, constructing elaborate reasons why cooperation might actually be the moral choice. This is what extended torture does. It doesn't just attack the body, it rewrites the architecture of thought itself. But on the sixth day, something changed. The routine had become predictable. 2 guards would come to his cell in the morning, drag him to the interrogation room, secure him to the chair, and then Keller and his assistant would arrive. But on this particular morning, only 1 guard came. The other, Henri would later learn, was ill, and the facility was understaffed because most personnel had been reassigned to deal with increased resistance activity in the north. The single guard was younger, perhaps 20, and he seemed nervous. He unlocked Henri's cell and gestured for him to stand. Henri did, moving slowly because every movement was agony. The guard stepped back to maintain distance, one hand on his holster, but he made a mistake that more experienced men would never have made. He didn't call for backup before opening the door. He assumed that a prisoner who could barely walk was not a threat. Henri had been a schoolteacher, not a soldier. He had never received formal combat training. But 6 days of torture had burned away everything soft in him, everything civilized, until what remained was something older and more fundamental. When the guard turned slightly to pull the cell door wider, Henri moved. Not quickly, because his body couldn't manage quick anymore, but with absolute commitment. He drove his shoulder into the guard's chest, slamming him against the stone wall. The guard tried to draw his weapon, but Henri was already on him, hands grasping for the pistol, fingers clawing, and they struggled in the narrow corridor outside the cell. The guard was younger, healthier, but he was also surprised and frightened, and Henri was operating on something beyond desperation. There was a moment of terrible intimacy as they wrestled for the gun, faces inches apart, and then the weapon went off with a sound that seemed to crack the world open. The guard collapsed. Henri stood over him, holding the pistol in shaking hands, and for several seconds couldn't process what had happened. The gunshot would bring others. He had perhaps a minute, maybe less. His body screamed at him to lie down, to give up, to accept that this was as far as he could go. But some part of him that had survived the interrogation, the part that had held on to names and addresses through all the pain, pushed him forward. He stumbled down the corridor toward the stairs, each step a negotiation with his broken ribs and burned skin. At the base of the stairs he heard voices above, shouts in German, the sound of boots on wood floors. They were coming. There was a small storage room to his left, door ajar, and Henri ducked inside. The room contained cleaning supplies, a mop, buckets, and on a shelf near the back, a German military jacket someone had left behind. Henri grabbed it and pulled it on over his torn shirt, the fabric rough against his burns. The voices were closer now, descending the stairs. He pressed himself against the wall behind the door and waited. 2 guards rushed past, heading toward the cells, and Henri stepped out behind them. One turned at the sound of movement, and Henri shot him without hesitation, then shot the second man as he spun around. The noise was enormous in the confined space. His ears rang and his hands were numb, but he kept moving, climbing the stairs now, emerging into what had once been the main floor of the townhouse. The entrance hall was empty, but he could hear activity in other parts of the building, doors opening, more voices. He crossed to the front door, expecting it to be locked or guarded, but found it standing slightly open, as if someone had just stepped outside. Later he would understand that this was simply luck, the chaos of an understaffed facility reacting to an emergency, but in the moment it felt like the universe had momentarily forgotten to close the door on him. He walked out into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after 6 days in the basement. The street was quiet, a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. A woman across the street was hanging laundry and she looked at him, this man in an ill-fitting German jacket with a swollen face and blood on his hands, and her expression didn't change. She simply turned back to her washing. In occupied Lyon, you learn not to see. Henri walked. Not running, because running would draw attention, but moving with purpose down the sidewalk, turning at the first corner, then another, putting distance between himself and the building. Behind him he heard shouts, a whistle, the sound of vehicles starting. They would be looking for him now, organizing search teams, setting up checkpoints. He had minutes at best before the entire district was sealed. His mind, still fractured from days of torture, struggled to form a plan. He needed to get off the street, needed to find help. But most of the safe houses he knew were in other parts of the city, and he wasn't sure he could make it that far. His vision was blurring at the edges and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Then he remembered something. A contact, not part of his usual network. A doctor named Rousseau who had treated resistance members before. Henri didn't know the address precisely, but he knew the street, a narrow lane near the Saône River, perhaps a mile away. He turned south, keeping to smaller streets, removing the German jacket and discarding it in an alley because it marked him more than it concealed. His shirt underneath was torn and bloody, but in a city that had seen years of occupation, such things were not as unusual as they might have been. He passed a German patrol and forced himself to walk normally, to not make eye contact, to be invisible. The soldiers didn't even glance at him. 3 blocks later he found the street he was looking for and recognized the building from a description someone had given him months earlier. Dr. Rousseau answered the door himself, a thin man in his 60s with careful eyes. He took one look at Henri and stepped aside without a word, ushering him into the house and locking the door behind them. In a rear room that smelled of antiseptic and old books, Rousseau examined Henri's injuries with professional detachment. He cleaned wounds, wrapped ribs, applied salve to burns, all while asking no questions. When he finished, he provided Henri with clean clothes and a place to rest. Only then did he speak, asking simply what Henri needed. Henri said he needed to get a message to his network, to warn them that he'd been compromised, that they needed to scatter. Rousseau nodded and said he would see what could be done. Then he left Henri alone in the small room with its single window overlooking a garden where nothing grew. Henri stayed in that room for 3 days while Rousseau quietly made contact with people who knew people. Word spread through the underground channels that Henri Deschamps had escaped Gestapo custody, and the network immediately went into emergency protocols. Safe houses were abandoned. Radio operators changed frequencies. People with exposed identities fled the city or went deep into hiding. The speed and efficiency of this response was the clearest proof that Henri's silence had mattered. Because he hadn't broken, because he'd held on through 6 days of interrogation, the network had maintained its integrity long enough to react to his escape. If he'd given them up on day 2 or 3, none of them would have had warning. They would have been rounded up in their homes, in their hiding places, without understanding why. The Gestapo, furious at the escape, intensified their operations in Lyon. They raided suspected safe houses and arrested anyone with tenuous connections to resistance activity. Klaus Barbie himself, the head of the Gestapo in the city and a man whose name would become synonymous with terror, reportedly demanded a full investigation into how a prisoner in their most secure facility had managed to kill 3 guards and walk out the front door. Heads would roll, both literally and figuratively, but Henri was already gone. On the 4th day after his escape, a truck driven by a resistance sympathizer collected him from Rousseau's house and drove him south, hidden under a tarpaulin among crates of vegetables, through checkpoints where German soldiers never thought to look beneath the produce. He reached the unoccupied zone and from there made his way to London via a route that took him through Spain and Portugal. The journey took weeks and he was still recovering from his injuries when he finally arrived in England, where he was debriefed by British intelligence officers who wanted to know everything about Gestapo interrogation methods and resistance networks in Lyon. Henri provided what information he could, though he found himself reluctant to speak about certain details, not because they were classified but because putting them into words somehow made them more real, more permanent. The British officers were particularly interested in how he'd managed not to break under torture, what techniques he'd used to resist, as if there was some formula that could be taught to others. But Henri couldn't give them a formula. He could only say that he'd held on because the alternative was impossible to live with, and that this was less about courage than about understanding what surrender would actually cost. The war continued for 2 more years after Henri's escape. The Lyon network he protected eventually reformed under new leadership with new protocols, and it continued to feed intelligence to the Allies until the liberation. Some of the people Henri had protected survived the war. Some didn't. Lucien, his friend who'd recruited him, was captured in a Gestapo sweep 6 months after Henri's escape and was executed at Montluc prison. Martha, who ran the safe house, made it through and lived to see Lyon liberated in September 1944. The priest who hid messages disappeared during a raid and was never heard from again. Dr. Rousseau continued his quiet work helping resistance members until the very end, and after the war he received recognition from the French government, though he never spoke publicly about any specific case. Henri himself never returned to Lyon during the war. He worked with Free French forces in London, training other resistance operatives and helping to coordinate supply drops and communications with networks inside occupied France. He struggled with nightmares and found that certain sounds, a door closing, water running, the scrape of a chair on a floor, could send him back to that basement room with its swinging bulb. But he also discovered that he could function despite this, that trauma was not something you overcame so much as something you learned to carry. After the liberation he did return to the city of his birth, and found it changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The building that had served as a Gestapo interrogation center was empty, its basement cells abandoned, and Henri stood outside it one afternoon trying to reconcile this ordinary townhouse with the place that existed in his memory. They weren't the same location, not really. The building he remembered was a place outside geography, outside time, and it existed now only in his mind and in the minds of others who'd been there. What Henri Deschamps did in that basement over 6 days in 1943 might seem like a small thing against the vast machinery of World War II. He wasn't at Stalingrad or Normandy. He didn't command armies or plan invasions. He simply refused to speak when speaking would have been easier than silence. But wars are made of such refusals, thousands of them, accumulated in basements and prison cells and quiet moments of choice where no one is watching and no one will ever know except the person making the decision. The resistance in France operated on a principle that every member understood. The network was only as strong as its weakest link, and everyone was potentially the weakest link if caught. What separated those who broke quickly from those who held on was not always a question of courage, but often a question of whether they could hold in their mind a reason to endure that was larger than their own survival. Henri gave the network time. That was his contribution. Not victory, not some decisive turning point, but time. Days and weeks for people to scatter, to warn others, to dismantle compromised operations before the Gestapo could roll them up. In the mathematics of resistance work, time was the most valuable currency, and Henri had purchased it with his silence at a price most people couldn't imagine paying. The physical escape, dramatic as it was, mattered less than what came before it. Killing the guards and walking out the door was simply the ending of something that had already been decided in those 6 days when he sat in the chair and said nothing while Keller asked his patient questions and the younger officer applied his cigarettes and water and fists. After the war, Henri returned to teaching. He never wrote a memoir or gave interviews about his experience. When students asked if he'd been in the resistance, he confirmed that he had been but offered no details. He married a woman named Claire who'd been a nurse during the occupation, and they had 2 daughters who grew up knowing their father had been involved in something important during the war but not exactly what. It was only after his death in 1983 that Claire released a short account he'd written, not for publication but for himself, describing what had happened in that basement. It was published in a small journal of resistance history and read by scholars and researchers but never gained wide attention. The account was notable for its restraint. Henri didn't dramatize or embellish. He simply described what happened and what he thought about while it was happening, and the plainness of the language made it more devastating than any amount of literary flourish could have achieved. The story of Henri Deschamps matters because it illuminates something essential about how ordinary people functioned under extraordinary pressure during the Second World War. The resistance was not composed primarily of professional soldiers or trained spies but of schoolteachers and shopkeepers and priests, people who had no preparation for violence or interrogation or the constant weight of knowing that their decisions could result in the deaths of others. They learned these things on the job, in real time, with no safety net and no guarantee that their sacrifices would make any difference. Many of them died without ever knowing whether their work mattered, whether the message they carried reached its destination, whether the Allied commanders actually used the intelligence they gathered. They operated on faith, not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the simple faith that resistance itself was worthwhile even if the outcome remained uncertain. And this, perhaps, is the real lesson encoded in Henri's 6 days of silence and his desperate escape. Not that he was exceptional, though in some ways he was, but that the capacity for such endurance exists in ordinary people when they have a reason that matters more than survival. The German officers who interrogated him were professionals operating with refined techniques developed over years of experience. They understood psychology and pain and the mechanics of breaking the human will. They failed not because Henri was superhuman but because he held in his mind something they couldn't touch with their cigarettes and their water and their patient questions. He held the faces of people he'd worked with, the knowledge of where they slept at night, the understanding that his words could reach through the walls of this basement and destroy them before morning. And he decided, moment by moment, session by session, that his pain was a price he could pay to keep those people safe for one more day. When the war ended and the full accounting began, the statistics were compiled and the monuments erected and the documentaries made. Henri's story was one of thousands that formed the substrate of resistance. Not the famous operations or the dramatic sabotages, but the quiet acts of endurance that happened in rooms no one would ever see, performed by people whose names would never be widely known. History tends to remember the spectacular and the photogenic, the D-Day landings and the fall of Berlin. But the war was also fought and won in moments like these, in basement cells where the only witness was the person refusing to break and the person trying to break them. These moments had no cameras, no audience, no immediate drama beyond 2 people engaged in a contest of will that one of them had to win. Henri won. Not through strength or training but through the simple stubborn refusal to let go of what mattered. And when the opportunity came, when the door was briefly unlocked and the guard was briefly alone, he seized it with everything he had left. The escape itself was messy and desperate, and could easily have failed at a dozen different points. But it didn't fail. He made it out, and the network survived because of the time he bought them, and some of the people he protected went on to do their own small and necessary parts in the larger machinery of resistance. Wars are built from such moments, stacked one upon another until they become something large enough to see from a distance, large enough to call history.